Hello, my name is David Sugar, and I wanted to do a quick presentation on systems thinking for strategic change. And this is one of the most impactful aspects of systems thinking, how we can use systems thinking to make change in the world, strategic change. Now, I've written a book called The Science of Systems, and if you want to learn more, you can go to my website, davidsugar.com/book. You can see the link here. Paperback's available on Amazon, and there's also a free PDF. I want to make it available for whoever wants it. So what does this mean, systems thinking for strategic change? Well, it's helpful to start off to say, what is a system? What are we talking about when we're talking about systems thinking? The basic part about a system is that there's different elements. Now, this is represented here with different circles, and these elements can really represent anything. It can represent different atoms, different chemicals, different cells, even different companies or different countries. And there might be different types of systems and different sizes of these elements. So, for example, if these are different companies, the different colors can represent different sizes, or the different colors can represent different types of companies, and the sizes can represent how big they are. How big the circle is could represent how large the company is. Now, a system is not just elements, but also relationships. And relationships are typically drawn by arrows. And this can represent any kind of relation that two elements have. So in the example of companies, this could represent a supply chain. Which company sends goods to what other company? And sometimes two companies can send it to each other, or it can just go one way, or it can be involved throughout the whole kind of ecosystem here. So this is the basics of a system, elements and relations, whatever they may be. Now, it's helpful to really parse out what is really meant by a part-based view. And in a parts-based view, it's really considering a linear system where one piece just influences the other piece. And when they're separated, it creates this effect of linearity where the whole is just a simple addition of the parts. So if you look at one of these parts, let's say there's two green elements and there's an arrow between them, and there's another relation of a blue and a red and an arrow between them, adding up each one individually is the same thing as looking at the whole. So the whole is just the sum of the parts. And linear systems are typically easy to predict, and one input would lead to one output. And there's a direct relationship there. It's easy to see. And when you look at it connection, it doesn't change. A system view is really saying, well, that these different pieces can be connected and it can be nonlinear. This means that the whole is not always a simple addition of the parts. So if you look at one of these relations, well, if you increase one, it may not just lead to a direct increase of something else. It can go throughout this, in this example, the supply chain or whatever it may be, like an ecosystem or something else, and it could come back to have an effect. So the whole is not a simple addition of the parts, and this means that the pieces are interrelated. So it's not just that one input leads to one output in a simple way. Things can be connected and things can be harder to predict a lot of the time, a lot more complex. So a systems-based view is not just about linear systems, also considering nonlinear systems. And this is what we often call complex systems. So I want to bring this back to systems change and how this can be applied. So let's consider the use of this technology here. It's a blue gear and social well-being. So this is using something called a causal loop diagram where an arrow is representing different types of relations. The plus means it's a direct relations. So in this example, the increase of use of the technology would also increase the social well-being. If there was a less amount of the technology, then social well-being wouldn't be as increased as much. So this is just considering a linear view of one leads to the other. There's not other connections. And the plus is this direct relation that we're talking about. Now, once you're starting to consider a systems view, it may not just be this linear type of situation. It may be a more nonlinear situation. So let's consider also the environmental health. So in this example, environmental health increases, and that also would increase the social well-being. So if the air is more clean, if there's more resources, then that would also promote more social well-being. But if there's less, there's a more pollution, and the environmental health is degraded, that means the social well-being would be decreased. So in this model, both of those relations are direct relations represented by a plus arrow. Now, this is kind of where we're getting into different kinds of trade-offs. So what if it's a situation that the use of this technology has an inverse relation with environmental health, and that's represented as a negative arrow? So an inverse relation would mean that when you're using this technology, it would decrease environmental health. And then that would also decrease social well-being. But if you increase or decrease the use of the technology, then the environmental health will increase, and that would promote more social well-being. So that negative arrow means that they're inversely related versus the plus arrow directly related. So you can see here there's a trade-off. You use the technology, it directly increases social well-being, but it has an inverse effect on environmental health, and that it reduces social well-being. So you can see here that there's trade-offs. If you want to optimize for social well-being, well, you need to be you have to think about how much you use this technology. So, a really easy example of this could be something like fossil fuels. So there is a lot of arguments to be made that, using fossil fuels, you can heat, you can transport, you can do, power a medical facility. You can do a lot of things that would promote social well-being. But it has an inverse effect on the environment where there's pollution, climate change, and that could decrease social well-being. So using that technology, there's trade-offs. So a systems view is not just about looking at the technology to the user and considering just one piece or the environment and the social well-being. It's considering this non-linearity and that there can be different kinds of what these are called feedback loops. And when you're optimizing it, it's very important. And I'll just say that from a systems-based view, a systems-based view is really trying to optimize the whole system. So what if it's possible to use a technology that improves social well-being, but also it doesn't harm the environment? There's a direct relation. So perhaps this could be renewable energy, where it can provide a lot of the same benefits we were just talking about with social well-being, but it's not harming the environment. It also may even contribute to the environment. For example, regenerative agriculture, there can be increase of social well-being, healthy food, but it's also regenerating the environment, building soil, reducing carbon, which has a knock-on effect of increasing social well-being. So a systems-based view is not just about seeing how one part connects to the other part, but optimizing the whole system. And so in this example, that would be working to change the technology and environment from an inverse to a direct relation. Now, there's a really interesting quote here by Gregory Bateson, famous systems theorist and cyberneticist, that says, "The whole system is the unit of survival." And I just think this is an amazing quote. And there's a really good connection here between biology and life and sustainability. So it's not just that the organism itself is the one unit of survival. It's the organism in the environment. So that's what's meant here when the whole system is unit of survival. It's not just about the survival of the fittest in an individual sense, but the survival of the fittest in the environment. And if you actually look more into Darwin's theory, that's what fitness really means. It's the fitness within the environment, not the fittest by itself. So if an organism so strong, so fit, let's say, that it destroys the environment, well, is not then fit into the environment. And so it has destroyed the very basis for the resources which allow it to survive. So fitness means that it's also supporting the environment so that itself can live. So this is a really interesting part about systems theory, and that when your life has already optimized from a systems perspective, it is optimizing its survival from the organism and the environment, not just the organism itself. And this is necessary for life, because if certain organisms extracted all the resources, there would be nothing else for it to grow. If it didn't use renewable energy like the sun, it would run out of energy. If it didn't use recyclable materials, it would run out of materials. If life didn't have resilient networks, it wouldn't be able to evolve and adapt. So life itself has evolved from a systems perspective to survive on the earth. So just wanted to make that connection here between sustainability and systems thinking. So now I just want to zoom out, because there's also some really important aspects about how we even think and model the world. So in some models, a certain technology may be beneficial, but there may be another person that sees the world another way, a different model, and in their model, the results could be different. So, which model is right? And how do you go about thinking about models in general? And models are very connected to systems change and understanding the world and identifying which levers that you want to change. So just for some fun, let's look at this L-shaped, L on its side, blue-shaped object. So if you were to imagine in your mind, how would you describe this blue object? How would you represent it by words or different shapes? How would you convey it in a language? How would you effectively make a model of it? So maybe in your mind's eye, you can think about this, of how you would make a model of this. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways that. So there's lots of different ways that this shape could be represented. You might think of it as a block on the left and another block attached. Perhaps there's a square on the top and there's a big block on the bottom. Or there's a miter joint, a 45 degree, where they both meet. It could be slice and dice in a number of other ways, or it might even just be the whole shape itself is what you're describing. Or it could just be that it's everything outside of the shape and not the shape itself. What we're trying to get at here is that there's no one way to represent it, and that there's a whole bunch of different and equally valid ways that one could go about representing this shape. The same reality can be perceived in many different ways, right? And so Gregory Bateson also had this great quote, which is that the division of the perceived reality into the parts and wholes may be convenient and may be necessary, but it shall not be determined how it is done. So there's no rules determining how we slice and dice reality. People can do it in different ways, different animals do it in different ways, and there can be different models of the world. So one example here, Gregory Bateson says is, some people with the hand may see 5 fingers, while he may see 4 empty places between. So both of these are valid divisions of the perceived reality. So another way of thinking about this famous quote by George Boxier, statistician, is that all models are wrong, some are useful. So this is explained more in science with the notion of a black box. So there could be a model of how a black box is used. You understand the inputs and outputs, but you never really know what's going inside. So one could have a very detailed model of this, different levers and different buttons representing out that purple, but you can't confirm. There's no test to confirm that a model is reality. Even if it predicts 99% of all the inputs and outputs, or even 100%, there's no model to confirm. So in science, reality is often considered, and nature itself is often considered, a black box, where we can have experiments and test inputs and outputs, but we never really know what nature is. We can have a very good map or model of the landscape, but there's no test to confirm that a given map is the landscape. Even in physics, where a model could be extremely precise, even if it's 100% precise, there's no way to know that's actually what reality is. But what can be known is that some models are more useful than others. So there's not really a debate to say my model is actually right and your model is actually wrong. This is what the substance or the ontology of reality itself is. What is being argued is saying this model is more useful than that model. And I'll just say evolutionarily, we have not evolved to see what is necessarily true or real. We've evolved to see what is most useful. And so from an evolutionary perspective, the brain takes many heuristic shortcuts to not necessarily see what's real, but see what's most useful and what's easiest to process data and energy. You can see in lots of visual illusions, things look different than what they geometrically are, and this is often a way for our brain to save resources. And I'll just say that there could be lots of different models of the world. And from thinking of a systems change perspective, stakeholder mapping is really important to get a shared understanding. So imagine there's these different people modeling the world. One of them sees a red triangle, another one sees a green square, and another one sees a purple pentagon. Well, it's really helpful to put that all on a map together. And so you can see what's going on at the same time, and you can develop a shared understanding, try to get some insight into the other person's world, and develop models that are useful. And I'll just say a final note here is that you can, of course, analyze the world forever and ever and never actually do anything. So there's always a balance between analysis and action. How much analysis is useful to create an important decision about how to act in the world? So there's no really scientific formula to balance this, but it's more of an art. And each decision requires different kinds of models. So it's important to have that note as well. So we've talked a little bit about what a system analysis is. And this is a model of the important factors involved. And like we said, there's no true model, and there's different ways to slice and dice the world. So it's not really about finding the right model, but it's really about finding a useful model for the relevant stakeholders for the given problem under consideration. So let's think about the conventional agricultural map. And this is a system that was drawn. I found it online. And this was a group of stakeholders that said, these are some of the important factors that we're considering and that were helping us gain an understanding of the system. So in this example, forage biomass has a direct relationship with environmental quality. This means that when the forage biomass increases, the environmental quality increases. But tillage practice, grading the soil and such, that would be negatively correlated, where there can be more dust and carbon removal. So that would be an inverse correlation, where more tillage means less environmental quality, while less tillage would increase the environmental quality. Now, this kind of system analysis is important for different stakeholders to see what are the relevant factors. Are there direct? Are they inverse relations? And now if I was to make a change in the system with limited time and energy, I can only change one thing or a few things. What should I change? And so getting a systems view can help you see leverage points and what are the most impactful ways that this system can be changed. So systems change is that idea of using systems thinking for strategic change, of having that effect have a ripple effect like the butterfly effect. And I'm just going to highlight some of these key strategies about systems change. So one can be is understanding the interconnections within and between systems. Seeing patterns of change over time rather than static snapshots. So seeing the evolution and seeing if you change something, can that create a knock-on effect, a ripple effect over time. Another is fixing root problems instead of symptoms and avoiding unforeseen consequences. So one example, in Australia, they introduced the cane toad to try to control pests, but large predators like birds and stuff were allergic and the toad was poisonous to them. So this caused a rapid decline in large predators, which was an unforeseen consequence, was disastrous effects. So oftentimes you're trying to fix one problem, but you're creating another. And this is, if you're looking at just from a linear view of one input to one output, you may not see that. So having that system analysis of the important factors and seeing the patterns over time and working to address these root problems is a helpful way to create systemic change. So determining leverage points and change agents for action. So this is important. We can't do everything. There's a limited amount of time, there's a limited amount of energy, so we have to pick what we do. So picking these leverage points is a way to create systemic change. And systemic change is really important when it comes to climate change, ecosystems, energy systems, waste systems, water systems. You kind of have to see all these moving parts and the interconnections within and between them to think about leverage points for strategic change. And finally, back to this idea of models, and it's really important to constantly learn, adapt, and to probe your own assumptions. There's not really one right model of nature. It's all about creating something useful. And nature itself is always changing. So our models themselves need to change over time. And of course, there's more. And I want you to think about, what some of these other strategies are and how you can implement them in your work in creating systemic change in our world. So Donella Meadows, in her book, Thinking in Systems, which is a great book about systems thinking and sustainability, help characterize different ways that we can change the system. So one of the basic ways, which are more short-term and more direct, could be to change the numbers involved in the systems. Like, let's imagine there's an environmental fee. And if that environmental fee is now higher, this could change how corporations and other actors act in the system. So just changing one of those numbers in the system is really important. Buffers. So this could be, for example, let's say there's a food storage that for drought, or that increasing the size of the buffer would add more stabilization to the system. So adding buffers is another important way to think about it. And Donella Meadows, she often characterized systems as stock and flow diagrams. These kind of stocks could be like a bath of water, and the flow could be different, input faucet and the output drain. And as we saw before with that example of the conventional agriculture system analysis, all those can have also mathematical equations put on it. There can be different numbers, the different rates of change can be, you can put differential equations, and you can model how it turns out. And so that could be helpful to predict results and see the effects of, creating these. But it should be noted that, these models aren't always perfectly correct, and it's not only just about a mathematical understanding and predicting precise results, but for stakeholders to have a shared understanding of what's going on and how we can use this for effective business, politics, and other complex systems that are not necessarily easy to predict, but you still want to know the important factors. So another intervention method Donella Meadows highlighted was just creating a new stock and flow structure, adding another stabilization. So imagine a house has solar panels. Now, if they're adding a battery, this is a new way to hold energy that's not relying on the grid, and that even if the grid goes down, the house could sustain itself. So delays is another important aspect of a system. Let's imagine there's financial data or ESG, environmental, social, and governance data for a company, and that's going to investors. Now, let's say it takes a week for investors to get this information. That's a delay. And now if, let's say that was reduced to 1 day or even 1 hour, now all of a sudden investors, other shareholders can make decisions with more real-time data. So decreasing the time between different elements and their relations is an essential part of how a system can be changed. So now we're going to work up. So these are more short-term specific. Now it's going to more medium-term and more systemic ways to change a system. So one way to do this is through balancing feedback. So balancing feedback, let's say that more income and there could be more taxes, while less income, less taxes. And so what this would do is help create a balancing effect, would help create a more balanced income distribution. So creating these balancing feedbacks to help bring things into balance is really important. So reinforcing is the opposite of balancing feedback, and this allows self-growing feedback. So one interesting way that this could be created is, let's say that money saved through energy efficiency is kept in an energy efficient fund. Now, as more and more energy is saved, the fund has grown. And now we can invest in more and more projects to save more money, which help grow the fund. So that's an example of a reinforcing feedback that helps feed on itself to create more and more. And you can create these in different kinds of systems to create different kinds of solutions. Information is key. So back to that example of investors getting data. Right now, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, just released the climate disclosure rule, which is saying that all corporations need to disclose some of their emissions. And so this is a huge, monumental, new type of information flow that's in the market. So now investors, shareholders will have this information. And this is a critical way of changing. Nothing has changed about the system except for the information. And now different actors can make completely different decisions, and it can completely systematically change complex scenarios. The rules. So, there's these underlying laws and governments that really dictate, what is even okay, what is even in the domain of possibilities. Right now, no modern, economy would think about using child labor. This is just a rule against it. But this wasn't always the case. This wasn't always a rule. So there can be new rules, introduced. And a lot of the rules are introduced by governments or introduced by the social acceptance of what is considered okay or not. So by changing the rules, that can have drastic effects on the system. Now, there's some other interesting things. One is self-organization, and these are getting into more higher-end, long-term, deep-rooted ways to change the system. So an example of this is an organization that I'm familiar with called AtmaGo. And AtmaGo is a social app for people to organize and during disasters and climate events to say, okay, here's where you can get shelter, here's where you can get food. And the good part about self-organizing systems is that you don't have to one person doesn't have to put all the information there. Everybody can put their information there. Kind of like Wikipedia. Everyone can add to it and it can self-organize. And these self-organizing, we've seen this in social media and other places, can be game-changing ways where there is a structure to self-organize and people work within that to create change. Now back to the idea of what are the underlying rules but also what are the goals of a system? So is it, for example, that the economic system's goals is to maximize GDP? Well, gross domestic product, that can relate to the total economic output of a country, for example, but it may not say, is that output good or bad? Is this to clean up oil spills or invest in military, or is it invested in health and education? There's no distinguishing in GDP. And also, the very wealthy people can increase their income while the majority of people decrease their income, but GDP will still seem to grow. So is GDP really, the goal of our economy? Or is it wealth after living expenses? Or is it social well-being? Is it, education, healthcare? What are we trying to optimize for? And so that is a critical thing of what is even the purpose of a system? And Donella Meadows has some interesting takes on this, which is that even though a system may seem completely malfunctional, every system is doing exactly what it should. It's just that the goal or the way the rules are set up is not aligned with what one may consider to be a good goal. So it's not like systems themselves are bad. Systems are just doing what they're doing. But it's important, they maybe have the wrong goals altogether. So as change agents, it's important for us to reconsider the goals. And humans and society and politics and governments are often about creating these rules and creating these goals. So now even zooming out further, the paradigm. The paradigm is the overall mind state. What are the goals, what are the rules, what is the framework of reality, basically, in which the system is even considered. And so there's this big paradigm shift now where there was Newtonian physics, which was really based on the world of everything's easy to predict, everything's mechanistic. There's information is not really in the nature, it's just this material kind of lifeless world. But now we've had chaos theory, complexity theory, and quantum mechanics and relativity, and now sustainability. And there's a new paradigm, a new scientific paradigm that our nature itself is really based on connection, complexity. There can be chaos, and there can also be cybernetic, right? That information of logical computers, that it's not just this lifeless, illogical nature, but that nature itself can have information, can have control systems. So this is a new paradigm, a new way of what we think nature is made up of, what the systems themselves are. So this new paradigm is really important for creating sustainability and being able to see our connections. Finally, I'll talk about transcending paradigms, this very interesting part, which is all about reevaluating. And like we talked about earlier, nature is not static. You know, it's often said change is the only constant. So it's really important that society has a culture to be able to reevaluate the important things, and that we don't have a culture where it's dogmatic and prescriptive to say that we can't reevaluate. So education is really important here, to constantly reevaluate our goals, our paradigm, and to be able to transcend the current situation if needed for a different worldview. So thank you for this. I hope this was insightful, some applications about systems thinking for strategic change. And if you want to learn more about systems science in general, check out The Science of Systems, a unified view of nature's patterns. You can find it on the link, get it on Amazon, and there's a free PDF. Thank you, everybody.